In this video, we're going to introduce some of the concepts associated with logic. So logic sort of bridges the gap between philosophy and mathematics. So you can think of logic as the science of reasoning. So it's a way of a reasoning in the sense that we want to determine how an argument could be structured so that it is a valid argument and you can arrive at a conclusion that you can assume is valid just based on how you structure an argument. You can also take an argument and then break it down and determine its validity, which is more so what we do in mathematics. So as you go further and further into mathematics, for instance, if you're a math major, what you spend a lot of time doing is using logic, justifying things, determining whether or not something is true, and if it is true, proving it in general, proving that it is true. So logic is mathematical in a sense, but it's not going to look like the math you're used to seeing. It's not algebraic. It's very, I don't know, what's the word? It's very, I don't want to say it's vague, but it's very open. It's very philosophical in nature. So for instance, I took a logic class in college, and it wasn't actually a math class. It was actually in a philosophy department. So logic is used mathematically, but there are other applications, and we can think of it as kind of a bridge between general philosophy, things that aren't really specific to math, and then topics that we do discuss in math, mainly proof, justification, those kinds of things. So a lot of what we're going to look at here is very similar to the kinds of things we used when we talked about sets, when we talked about Venn diagrams. So if we're looking at a Venn diagram, the basic element of a Venn diagram is a set. We're looking at sets, how they're related to one another. Well, when we're talking about logic, the basic element of logic is what we call a statement. So it's a sentence, but it's a sentence that either is true or false, but it can't be both at the same time. Now, one thing we need to emphasize now is that you don't have to know that the statement is true or false in order for it to be a statement. Which means that in terms of logic, we can talk about subjects that we don't actually have any personal knowledge of. The idea is not, we know something about this topic, so we're going to talk about this topic. The idea is, whether we know anything about this topic or not, how do we structure an argument using statements, using logical structures, logical concepts, so that we can arrive at a valid conclusion. We're focusing more on the structure of things rather than the actual content. So when we're structuring what we call a statement, a sentence that is a statement, it has to be declarative, and it has to be something that's either true or false. So what, for instance, is not a statement? Well, a command is not a statement. A command is neither true nor false. A question is not a statement. It can't be true or false. And the one that's kind of hard to identify from time to time is going to be an opinion. Opinions are not true or false either. Opinions are based on value judgments. So an opinion can be true for some person, but it can be false for a different person. So anything that's representative of an opinion, something that involves a value judgment, is not going to be considered a statement. So examples of statements. William Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet, okay? It's either true or it's false. We happen to know that this statement is true, but again, if you know nothing about Shakespeare, you have no idea what Romeo and Juliet is, it doesn't matter. Just based on the structure of this sentence, the sentence is either true or it's false, so it's going to be a statement. Now also, William Shakespeare wrote Game of Thrones, also a statement. This one happens to be false. But again, if you don't know anything about Shakespeare, you don't know anything about Game of Thrones, doesn't matter. This statement is either true or it's false, so it does represent what we're calling a statement. Now, examples of things that are not statements. Read Shakespeare's plays. What's wrong with that? Well, that's a command. You're telling someone to do something. There is no truthfulness or falseness involved with a command. It's just not that kind of sentence, so that would not be a statement. Do you enjoy reading Shakespeare? Again, not a statement, it's a question. It can't be true, it can't be false, it's just a question that we're posing to someone, so that's not a statement. And then the next one, again, this is the one where it gets kind of iffy, but we have to think about what the sentence is really saying. So Shakespeare is the greatest English playwright. Well, it could be true or false, but it could be true for some people and it could be false for other people. It involves an opinion, it involves a value judgment. So we can't have a sentence that could be both true and false at the same time. That's the issue with an opinion. It could be true for some people, it could be false for other people, so we don't classify something like that as a statement. So it's got to be something completely separate from a value judgment. It's got to be a declarative sentence. It's got to be something that's either true or false, but not both at the same time. And again, we don't need to know ourselves whether or not it's true or false in order for it to be a statement. It's just based on how the sentence is structured. So what we're going to focus on is how we would represent statements and then some of the associated constructs using symbols. Just like when we're talking about a set, we have roster method to list out all the elements in the set. But if we're just talking about the set in general, maybe we want to structure some type of operation between sets. We don't necessarily want to have to write out the whole set every time. So we label it, and just based on the label, we know what the label represents, and we can use the label to manipulate the set rather than having to write out all the contents of the set every time. So when we're talking about a statement is going to be represented using a lowercase letter, and the ones we tend to use are going to be P, Q, R, and S. That's arbitrary. It really could be anything, but those happen to be the letters that we use frequently. So we can express a statement, which again just expresses an idea that's either true or false. If we have an idea that's either true or false, but not both, then we can also negate the statement. So the negation of a statement expresses the opposite information. So it's going to give you a new statement, but it's a new statement that communicates the opposite idea. Essentially, you can imagine introducing the word not into your sentence, and that would create what we can think of as the negation of your statement. Now, this is going to be very important. This is going to help us when we actually want to write the negation and make sure we interpret it correctly. The negation of a true statement is going to be false. In other words, if we express the opposite of something that's true, that opposite statement has to be false. And then the negation of a false statement has to be true. So it's going to be one or the other. If we negate a statement, the truth value is going to flip. Now, symbolically, when we want to negate a statement, this is going to be the symbol we use. This is called a tilde. So the way we would write the statement P, but negated, is going to be this. The way we would read this is not P, or P negation, something like that. But the shortest way to say it is going to be not P. Now, English is kind of a strange language in the sense that there's a lot of different ways to say the same thing. So in terms of negating a statement, there are different ways to express a negated statement. Some ways are more straightforward than others, but we want to investigate all the different ways we could structure a statement because it's important to be able to recognize what's really being said. When things are being overcomplicated in terms of the wordiness, what's really being said? What's the essence of the statement? Ideally, we want to write things in the most simple way possible, but we need to recognize when someone's using language to overcomplicate things, what's the real essence of what they're saying. So let's look at a few examples. So we've defined the statements P, Q, and R. So P is the statement, William Shakespeare wrote Game of Thrones. Q is the statement, London is the capital of Great Britain. And R is the statement, Paris is not the capital of Spain. So we want to express the negation, not P, not Q, and not R, of all of these statements, and we want to write it in words. And what we want to look at is some of the different ways that we can write these statements in words. So first statement, William Shakespeare wrote Game of Thrones. First off, we know that's a false statement, okay? If we say not P, we're taking that statement and we're negating it. We're expressing the opposite piece of information. So William Shakespeare wrote Game of Thrones. If we want to express the opposite information, one way we could say that is William Shakespeare did not write Game of Thrones. So that would be one version of the negation of that statement. Now, when we write the negation, particularly if we have some context for what we're talking about in the statement, using the truthness and the falseness combination is going to be important. It's going to help us make sure that we've structured our statements correctly. So our first statement, what we started with, William Shakespeare wrote Game of Thrones. We know that's going to be a false statement. When we negate this, because it's false, we should end up with something that has to be true. So not P, William Shakespeare did not write Game of Thrones. Sure enough, that results in a statement that is true. So that negation makes sense in light of that change from false to true. Okay, next one. Q, London is the capital of Great Britain. So we want to negate that. But let's negate that one in a different way. There's a different way of saying something is no longer true. One way of taking the opposite information, besides just adding the word not, like we did right here, another way of saying that is, it is not true that, adding in that particular phrasing. It is not true that London is the capital of Great Britain. So that would express the opposite piece of information from the original statement Q. Now what about truth and falseness? London is the capital of Great Britain. Well, that would be a true statement. So when we negate it, we should have a false statement. It is not true that London is the capital of Great Britain. Well, that would have to be a false statement. So that negation does make sense. Now the last one is kind of a special case. It's one of those situations where wording can become questionable, and we have to think about the simplest way in which to communicate a piece of information. So the statement R, Paris is not the capital of Spain. So first off, is it true or is it false? Paris is not the capital of Spain. Well, that is a true statement. Paris is the capital of France. Paris is not the capital of Spain. That is a true statement. Okay. What if we negate that though? The issue here is that this statement already has the word not in it. So it already has some element of being negative associated with the original statement. So what would happen if we negate it? How do we handle something like that? Well, in the most literal sense, negation means adding the word not. So Paris is not the capital of Spain. Well, we would never write something like that in the English language. It's just not grammatically correct. We don't write something like that, and it's not a good way to communicate what we're trying to say. So if we think of not, it is not the case that Paris is not the capital of Spain. You can think of the not that we already have there representing a negative, and the not that we introduce when we negate the statement as being sort of a double negative. Well, a double negative combines to give us a positive. So rather than saying it is not the case that Paris is not the capital of Spain, we could just say that Paris is the capital of Spain. The not that we already have, the not we introduce with the negation, we can take both of those, combine them together, and that takes our negative statement and makes it a positive statement. Paris is the capital of Spain. That would be the most straightforward way of expressing that negation. But again, we need to double check, particularly if we have context for the statement we're looking at, the content in the statement. If we start with something true, it needs to be false, and vice versa. So the original statement, Paris is not the capital of Spain. Well, we know that is a true statement. Paris is not the capital of Spain. When we negate it, Paris is the capital of Spain. Well, now we have a false statement. So we went from a true statement to a false statement. So that negation makes sense. So there's a variety of ways to negate things, to express the opposite piece of information. But again, anytime you do this, when in doubt, if possible, you want to fall back on this idea of converting truth values. So we start with something true, we negate it, it becomes false. We start with something false, we negate it, and it becomes true. Now in mathematics, we talk about quantification, quantifying things, contributing a number, associating a number with the things we're talking about. So some of the statements that we'll be interested in are what we call quantified statements. Quantified statements involve something associated with an amount. And it's not going to be a specific amount in the sense of we have 5 apples, something like that. It's general terms that indicate some type of amount. So the way we know why we have a quantified statement is we're going to have some combination of these words, all, some, or no or none. Those are kind of interchangeable. So all means all of it. We know what all means. Some means a portion, some fraction, and then none, of course, we know what that means. These indicate some type of amount involved in what we're communicating. So these words are what we call quantifiers. They're the words that indicate we're talking about an amount when we discuss whatever we're discussing in our statement. Now, just like with negation, there are different ways to express a quantity. This is where the wording becomes really strange. There's always a very straightforward way to write something, and there are usually a lot of different ways to write something in a not very straightforward way. So I had a student ask me once, why would you ever want to talk about making a sentence more complicated if the idea is that you always want to write it in the clearest and the most sensical way possible? Why would you want to make it more complicated and express it in a really wordy, unnecessary way? Well, the idea is that we technically don't. We don't want to ever write something in anything other than the clearest, easiest to understand way. But that's not always what you're going to encounter in real life. So for instance, you listen to advertising, you listen to political messages. Different things are disguised in language. So when we hear something, we have to really think about the essence of what's being said, what's really being communicated, because language can be used to disguise the actual meaning of what's being said. So we need to understand when we see something that's maybe not worded in the most straightforward way possible, what's really being said, what's the idea that's really being communicated. When we communicate an idea, we want to communicate it in the most straightforward way possible so that people can understand what we're trying to communicate. But we're not always going to receive communication that is given in the most straightforward way. So being able to understand what we're hearing is very valuable. It's going to be very important to make sure we, can really understand what we're hearing. We can determine whether an argument makes sense, and we can make those judgments for ourselves. So we're going to talk about how we would take something that's quantified with our basic quantifiers and different ways we might communicate the same idea using different types of wording. So the most straightforward version of a statement, all A are B. So A and B would be just individual little snippets, little phrases, all A are B. Another way of saying all A are B is there are no A that are not B. If all A are B, then we can't find an A that is not B. That's another way of saying it. Some A are B. Another way of saying that is there exists at least one A that is a B. That's sort of a definition for the term some. Some means there's at least one. Some is not a specific amount. It doesn't mean we have 3 or 5 or 7, anything like that. Some just means there's at least one. There could be a lot, there could be a very few, but there's at least one. No A are B. Another way of saying this is all A are not B. If there are no A that are B, then we can say that all A are not going to be B. Some A are not B. Another way of saying this is not all A are B. If some A are not going to be B, then we can find at least one A that is not B. It's not the case that all A are B. Now this seems very, very vague if we're just talking about A and B, which doesn't really have any meaning to us. But what if we put this in the context of real statements, real terms that we can understand? Let's look at some examples. Okay, so we have some quantified statements. We want to rewrite each of them in equivalent ways. In other words, take this wording and write it in a different way using a different kind of wording. So when it's given in a straightforward way, what might it look like if we were to overcomplicate the wording? So first, all poets are writers. Okay, every single person who's a poet is a writer. Another way of saying this is there are no poets that are not writers. If every poet is a writer, then it's not the case that we can find a poet who's not a writer. So these two statements would be equivalent. They communicate the same type of information. All poets are writers. There are no poets that are not writers. Now, one thing to pay attention to here, if we're expressing one statement in the same way, in other words, or I guess I should say we're expressing a statement in an equivalent way. We're expressing it a different way, but it's supposed to communicate the same information. Then we should start with something that's true and have something that remains true. Or if we start with something that's false, we should have a new statement that is also false. So let's think about this one. All poets are writers. Is that true or false? Every poet is also a writer. Well, that would have to be a true statement. The category of poets is a subset of the category of writers. If you want to think in terms of sets, what we recently talked about. All poets are writers is a true statement. Well, what about the equivalent statement? There are no poets that are not writers. You can't find a poet who's not also a writer. Well, that's also going to be a true statement. Next one, some people are rude. I would say that that's probably a true statement, okay? What does the word some mean? Some means there exists at least one, or there exists at least one, there exists a person that is rude. That's the same idea. Some people are rude. Well, I guess that's true. I would assume that's true. I feel like I've encountered a couple rude people in my life. There exists at least one person that is rude. Also, that would have to be a true statement. No giraffes are short. Well, I guess that's kind of iffy. Baby giraffes are kind of short, right? But they're definitely taller than human babies. I would still say they're pretty tall. No giraffes are short. We'll say that's a true statement. Okay. The equivalent way of expressing this, no giraffes are short, is all giraffes are not short. Every single giraffe is not short. If all giraffes are short, no giraffes are short, it's the case that all giraffes are not going to be short. Okay, so we go from a true statement to a true statement. Now with this one in particular, we want to be careful about how we use wording when we want to express something equivalently. Notice that what we're changing here are the quantifiers. The words like all, no, none, some, those kinds of things. We're changing those words. What we're not changing are the words that express the content of the statement. So the one I want to look at here is the word short. When we want to say that something is not short, so no giraffes are short. Well, one think of giraffes as being tall, right? So you might think when we want to express the same statement in a different way, no giraffes are short, maybe another way of saying that is all giraffes are tall. We can't really do it that way because again, we have to think in the context of, what if we had a statement that we didn't actually have any context for? What if you don't know what a giraffe is, and what if you don't know what the word short means? All we're doing is structuring sentences in an equivalent way. So you have to take yourself out of the context of the content. If you didn't know what the actual content words meant, how would you know how to take something like the word short and convert it to something like the word tall? Well, you wouldn't. If this was written in a foreign language and you didn't know that language, you wouldn't know to change the word short to the word tall to express some type of equivalent information. So whenever we change the wording, we're changing the words that quantify the statement, not the actual words that give the statement its content. We want to include all of those keywords. So here the keywords are giraffes and short. When we express this statement in an equivalent way, those two words still need to be there. What changes is that no is now expressed as all or not. That's what's being changed when we're communicating this idea in a different way. Okay, one more. Some students do not work hard. I am a teacher, so I can say, yes, officially that is true. Most students do work hard, but some students do not work hard. So another way of expressing this one is not all students work hard. If some students don't work hard, then not all students work hard. It's not the case that all students work hard. And again, that's also going to be a true statement. We start with something that's true. We end up with an equivalent statement that is also true. Now, the other thing we want to talk about is how do we negate a quantified statement? It's not as simple as adding the word not when you want to negate a quantified statement. You can do that, but it's typically going to make the statement wordier than it needs to be. Just adding in the word not with the pre-existing quantifiers usually makes it a little bit more complicated and wordy than it needs to be. There's usually a more straightforward way to express the new negated statement. So when we want to negate a statement, we're changing the quantifiers and we're changing the value, the parity, I think would be a good word for it, positive or negative. Okay, so suppose we start with the statement all A are B. If we negate that, the negation would be some A are not B. If it's not the case that all A are B, then we can say that some A are not B. Now the opposite is also true. So these relationships go both ways. If we want to say that it's not the case that all A are B, then another way of saying that is some A are not B. Well, if it's not the case that some A are not B, then another way of saying that is all A are B. So it goes both ways. Now, what if we said some A are B? The opposite statement to that, the negation of that, is no A are B. If it's not the case that some A are B, then we can say that no A are B. If it's not the case that no A are B, then we can say that some A are B. Now, how do you remember these relationships? I don't want you to have to memorize something like a table. How are these relationships really structured when we take a statement and we negate it? What we're changing, if you notice, we're changing two things. We're changing the amount, whether we're talking about an all-encompassing blanket statement type amount. We're changing from all to partial. And then we're changing the parity, the value. We're going from positive to negative. So for example, all A are B. It's a blanket statement, all, and it's positive. We're saying all A are B. So blanket statement and positive. Notice when we negate it, we go from all to some, and we go from are to are not. If we were to go in the opposite direction, we go from partial and negative to all and positive. So we're changing both components when we negate a quantified statement. We're changing from all to partial. We're changing from positive to negative, or vice versa. Some A are B, partial, positive. Convert it, no A are B, all and positive. No A are B. Okay, sorry, all and negative. No is both all and negative. So no has two parts to it. None, you could say none instead. None would mean all of them, but it would mean all in the negative sense. So some and positive, and then all and negative. And then vice versa, it would flip the other way as well. So you have to think about both components being negated. Now, particularly with this kind of operation, it's okay if when you write it the first time, it doesn't seem like it's structured really well in the most straightforward way. You can take a moment, you can write down what literally happens when you translate these two components, when you switch them, and then rework it just a little bit. You know enough more than likely about the English language to be able to simplify a little bit of your wording to express it in a slightly more straightforward way. But what we do want to adhere to is this idea of the quantifiers changing. What's really changing? How are they changing? When we take a quantified statement and negate it, we want to end up eventually with another quantified statement that's written in the most straightforward way possible. So we want to take each of these statements, we want to negate it, but the negation, once we finish it, it should start with the word all, some, or no. There will always be different ways to express a quantified statement. We saw that up here. There's different ways of saying all things, but there's always a most straightforward way of saying something. So when we convert, when we negate these statements, we want to make sure that we convert in a sense or in such a way that we're communicating the new idea in the most straightforward way possible. Now this rule with truthfulness, falseness, this is true here as well. It's true for any statement, quantified or not. So if you start with something that's true and negate it, you end up with something that's false. You start with something that's false, negate it, you end up with something that's true. So let's look at all of these. We're going to look at the same statements we saw before, but now we want to write not an equivalent statement that gives the same idea, but the negation of the statement, which is going to give the opposite idea. So all poets are writers. First off, we decided that was a true statement. It is the case that if you are a poet, then you are a writer. That is a true statement. Now we're negating that. Here's the symbol we're going to use to negate. So if we use our tilde, our not symbol, and put parentheses around our statement, that's a way of telling or communicating that we're negating that statement. We're taking that statement and we're expressing the opposite information. So let's think about what's being communicated here. We have all and we have positive. So when we negate it, it's going to go from all to partial, and it's going to go from positive to negative. So all poets are writers, negated, becomes some poets are not writers. So all and are, negated, becomes some are not. And notice that the key words, the words that give us the content, those didn't actually change. So poets and writers, that stayed. The only thing that changed was the words that involve the quantification and then the value, positive or negative. Some poets are not writers. Well, that's definitely going to be a false statement. If you can find a poet that's not a writer, then you can find one. But in this case, you're not going to be able to find a poet that's not a writer. So this is not going to be a true statement. So we go from something that's true, negate it, and we end up with a false statement. Okay, some people are rude. Again, we decided that was going to be a true statement. So now we want to negate it. So we're going from partial and positive to all and negative. Well, all and negative, rather than using the word all and using the word not, another way of saying all and negative is going to be the word no or none. So some people are rude, negate the statement. The negation would be no people are rude. And again, we can check it by making sure that we go from something that's true to something that's false. So some people are rude, that's going to be true. No people are rude is then going to be a false statement. Okay, let's look at a couple more. No giraffes are short. Okay, so we decided that we're going to consider this one true. From a relative standpoint, giraffes are not short. No giraffes are short. We'll consider that to be a true statement. So we're going to negate it. No means all-encompassing and negative. So when we negate it, we're going to go to partial and positive. So no giraffes are short converts to some giraffes are short. So no means all and negative. Some and are is going to be positive. So no giraffes are short, some giraffes are short. Okay, so we go from a true statement, some giraffes are short, that's going to be a false statement. And then last, some students do not work hard. So we have partial and negative. We negate it. We go to all-encompassing and positive. So some students do not work hard. The negation, the opposite statement, all students work hard. And so we go from what I would consider a true statement to being a false statement. I wish it was a true statement, but unfortunately, I think in a lot of situations, it's a false statement. Now, what's potentially difficult here? You do have to remember this idea that both the quantifier and the value, the positive or negative value, has to change when we negate something that's quantified. What's tempting to say is that the opposite of all is none, but that's not necessarily the case. If you take a statement involving the word all and change it to a statement involving the word no or none, then what you'll typically end up with is something that started false and stayed false, or started true and stayed true, something like that. You're not going to have something that really communicates the opposite idea. So when we convert, we have to remember that we're converting both of these components. We're converting an all-encompassing statement to something that's partial. We're converting a positive statement to something that is negative. So we're going to use both of these kinds of statements from here on out. Again, think of a statement as just being the basic element of logic. This idea of logic is we're structuring arguments. We're trying to learn to structure them in such a way that we can draw valid conclusions. So even if we don't really know anything about the content of an argument, the content of a discussion, we can determine whether or not an argument or discussion makes sense just from the standpoint of structure.